An old hat of a defeated old man? Not worth a penny.
A teen spit on a war veteran's cap. Moments later, his father showed up. "Son," Bob said quietly, his weathered hands trembling as he wiped the spit from his military cap. "Do you know what this hat represents?" Tyler laughed mockingly. "Some old man living in the past. Get over it, Grandpa." The veteran's steel blue eyes met the teenager's defiant gaze. "This cap represents 220 Americans who never came home. It represents my best friend Jimmy, who died at 19 saving my life in Vietnam. It represents every soldier who sacrificed everything so you could stand here today and say whatever ignorant thing comes to your mind." Tyler's smirk faltered as the weight of those words hit him. I didn't know." But before he could finish, a familiar voice called out from behind, "Tyler, what the hell are you doing?" The teenager's face went pale as his father approached, and what happened next would change both their lives forever. Don't miss the incredible conclusion to this powerful story. Subscribe for more life-changing tales hit like If This Touched Your Heart, and listen to the full story to discover how one moment of disrespect became a lesson in forgiveness that transformed an entire family. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. At Memorial Park, a 72-year-old war veteran sat quietly on a stone bench, his weathered military cap resting beside him. Suddenly, a 16-year-old teenager walked by, spat on the cap, and laughed mockingly. The old man said nothing, just silently wiped it clean. But fate had other plans. The teenager's father was about to appear, and what happened next would change both their lives forever. The late afternoon at Memorial Park painted a picture of serene remembrance. Golden sunlight filtered through the ancient oak canopy, casting dancing shadows on the weathered stone pathways. The gentle chorus of birds mingled with distant laughter of children playing on swings. Rows of granite memorial stones stood in silent formation like eternal sentinels, each bearing the names of fallen heroes who had given their lives for freedom. The air carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and the earthy smell of freshly turned soil from the memorial garden. A gentle breeze rustled through the American flags that lined the memorial walkway, creating a soft whisper that seemed to carry the voices of the departed. Robert Bob Mitchell, 72 years old, Vietnam War veteran. His face bore the deep lines carved by time and sorrow, yet his steel blue eyes retained the sharp alertness of a soldier who had seen too much. Every Friday, he made his pilgrimage to this sacred ground, settling onto the same weathered stone bench to commune with ghosts, the names etched in granite who had once been his brothers in arms. His olive green military cap, faded and worn soft by decades of handling, was the sole survivor from his days in Saigon. The 1st Cavalry Division patch still clung proudly to its front, though the edges had begun to fray. Bob lived alone in a cramped studio apartment across town, surviving on a modest veteran's pension and Social Security. His only son, Michael, had died in a car accident the previous year, a loss that had shattered what remained of Bob's already fragile world. The apartment felt like a tomb filled with photographs and memories, so Memorial Park had become his sanctuary, the place where he could breathe freely among those who understood sacrifice. The nightmares still came regularly. Flashes of jungle warfare, the screams of wounded comrades, the weight of decisions that haunted him for 5 decades. But here, surrounded by the names of the fallen, he found a strange peace. These stone monuments didn't judge him for surviving when others hadn't. They simply stood witness to the price of freedom. Modern society seemed to have forgotten the sacrifices of previous generations. Bob felt like a ghost wandering through a world that no longer valued the principles he had fought to defend. The loneliness was crushing, not just the absence of human companionship, but the deeper isolation of being a relic from a time when duty, honor, and sacrifice meant something. Young people walked past these memorials without a glance, absorbed in their phones and their immediate concerns. The disconnect between his generation and theirs felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Today was different. For the first time in 5 years, Bob had brought his military cap with him. Something had compelled him. Perhaps the vivid dream he'd had the night before about his best friend Jimmy, who had died at Khe Sanh. In the dream, Jimmy's voice had been crystal clear. Bob, don't let them forget us. Don't let our sacrifice become meaningless. The dream had felt so real that Bob had awakened with tears on his cheeks and Jimmy's words echoing in his mind. As he placed the cap beside him on the bench, it felt like a sacred ritual, a promise to his fallen comrades that their memory would not fade into obscurity. The cap seemed to pulse with the weight of history, carrying within its faded fabric the souls of all those who had worn similar headgear in service to their country. Bob had no grand strategy, only a simple desire to honor the memory of his fallen brothers. He had brought along his old leather journal, its pages yellowed with age, intending to write a letter to his granddaughter Sarah, the only family member who still maintained regular contact with him. In this letter, he wanted to share the stories of real heroes, to explain the true meaning of patriotism and sacrifice to a generation that had never known war on their homeland. He hoped that by sharing these stories, he could bridge the gap between past and present, helping young people understand that their freedom wasn't free. It had been purchased with blood and sacrifice by men and women who believed in something greater than themselves. The letter would be his small contribution to preserving the memory of those who could no longer speak for themselves. Bob began writing with trembling hands. "My dearest Sarah, today, your grandfather wants to tell you about the friends who shaped his life." The first words came slowly, each letter a struggle against the weight of memory and emotion. So many stories, so much pain, so many faces that would never age beyond their final moments in the jungle. He paused, looking up at the sky, trying to find the composure to continue. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, and Bob took it as a sign. Jimmy had always said hawks were messengers from the spirit world. The bird's cry seemed to encourage him, reminding him that life continued and that stories needed to be told no matter how difficult they were to share. Bob managed to write 2 full pages about Jimmy, his best friend who had saved his life during the Battle of Ia Drang. The words flowed more naturally as he wrote, as if Jimmy were sitting beside him, guiding his hand. He described Jimmy's infectious laugh, his terrible jokes that somehow made the horror bearable, and his unwavering courage in the face of impossible odds. Bob felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, as if a burden he carried for 50 years was finally being shared. The old military cap beside him seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, no longer just a piece of cloth and metal, but a tangible connection to all the young men who had worn similar caps and never returned home. Each word Bob wrote was a small act of resurrection, bringing his fallen friends back to life on the page. Several passers-by noticed the elderly man riding beside the military cap. A middle-aged couple paused respectfully, the husband removing his own cap in a gesture of respect. A young mother knelt down to explain to her small son what the cap represented, pointing to the memorial stones and speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the men and women who had served their country. Bob felt their respect like warm sunlight on his face. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible or forgotten. These strangers recognized the significance of what he represented, and their acknowledgement validated his existence in a way that nothing had since Michael's death. Another veteran, approximately 65 years old, approached and asked if he could sit down. The man introduced himself as Frank Rodriguez, a Marine who had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 3rd Marine Division. They didn't need many words. The understanding between them was immediate and profound. Frank had his own collection of ghosts, his own burden of survivor's guilt, his own struggle to find meaning in a world that seemed to have moved on without them. They sat in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, 2 old soldiers sharing the weight of memory. When Frank finally spoke, it was to share a story about a young Marine named Carlos, who had died saving his squad from a grenade. Bob reciprocated with the story about Jimmy's final act of heroism. In that exchange, both men found something they had lost, the knowledge that they were not alone in their pain. Before leaving, Frank invited Bob to attend the weekly veterans meeting at the VFW Hall. Bob hesitated. He had avoided such gatherings for years, finding them too painful, too full of memories he wasn't ready to confront. But something in Frank's eyes, the genuine warmth of human connection, made him reconsider. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start embracing it. Frank left his phone number and a gentle reminder that healing often required community. "We're all carrying the same weight, Bob," he said. "It's easier when we carry it together." As Frank walked away, Bob felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Just as Bob was preparing to pack up his writing materials, a group of teenagers approached along the main pathway. Among them was Tyler Morrison, 16 years old, tall and athletic, with the cocky swagger of youth. He was engaged in a heated argument with his friends about some video game, his voice loud and abrasive in the peaceful setting of the Memorial Park. Tyler's appearance was that of a typical modern teenager: designer sneakers, expensive jeans, and a smartphone constantly in his hand. His hair was styled in the latest fashion, and his attitude suggested someone who had never faced real hardship or responsibility. He moved through the world with the casual entitlement of someone who had never questioned where his privileges came from. When Tyler's gaze fell upon Bob in the military cap, his expression shifted to one of disdain. To him, the old man represented everything outdated and irrelevant about previous generations, a relic clinging to past glories that had no meaning in the modern world. "Look at this," Tyler announced to his friends, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another old guy living in the past with his war costume?" His friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Tyler was crossing a line, but none had the courage to speak up. Tyler approached Bob with deliberate arrogance, his friends trailing behind with growing unease. The teenager's eyes fixed on the military cap with obvious contempt. "What's with the old hat, Grandpa? Still pretending to be some kind of hero?" Bob looked up slowly, his steel blue eyes meeting Tyler's defiant gaze. The old veteran's face remained calm, But something deep within those eyes, a hardness forged in combat, made Tyler's friends take an involuntary step backward. Without warning, Tyler leaned forward and spat directly onto the military cap. The saliva landed on the faded 1st Cavalry Division patch, desecrating not just a piece of cloth, but the memory of every soldier who had worn that insignia. Time seemed to freeze. Bob stared at his defiled cap, the sacred symbol of his service, his sacrifice, his fallen brothers. His hands trembled not with rage, but with profound grief. This wasn't just an insult to him personally, it was a desecration of everything he held sacred. Slowly, deliberately, Bob reached for a tissue and began cleaning the cap. His movements were gentle, almost reverent, as if he were tending to a wounded comrade. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. "Son," Bob said, finally, his voice quiet, but carrying the authority of someone who had faced death and survived. "Do you know what this cap represents?" Tyler laughed, but the sound was hollow, lacking his earlier confidence. Some old man who can't let go of the past, someone who thinks the world owes him something because he played soldier 50 years ago. Bob stood slowly, his modest height somehow seeming to tower over the teenager. "This cap represents 58,220 Americans who never came home. It represents friends of mine who died so that you could stand here today and say whatever you want to say, no matter how ignorant or hurtful it might be." Tyler felt a chill run down his spine at the old man's words, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He was preparing to deliver another cutting remark when a familiar voice called out from behind him, "Tyler, what the hell are you doing?" The voice carried a mixture of shock, anger, and something deeper, a profound disappointment that cut through Tyler's bravado like a knife. Tyler turned to see his father, David Morrison, 45 years old, approaching at a rapid pace. David was an accomplished attorney who had been taking his evening jog through the park when he spotted his son in what was clearly a confrontational situation with an elderly veteran. David's face was pale with shock and growing understanding as he took in the scene. His son standing defiantly over an old man holding a military cap, the tension in the air palpable. David's own father had been a Vietnam veteran who had died the previous year, taking with him stories of service and sacrifice that David now realized he had failed to pass on to his son. David Morrison approached slowly, his eyes moving from his son to Bob, then to the military cap in the old man's hands. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. His son, his own flesh and blood, had somehow dishonored a veteran, a man who might have served alongside David's own father. "Sir," David said to Bob, his voice barely above a whisper, "could you please tell me what happened here?" Bob recounted the incident with remarkable composure, his voice steady and factual, without a trace of anger or desire for revenge. He simply told the truth, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Tyler stood frozen, watching his father's face transform from confusion to horror to profound shame. "My son did this?" David asked, his voice cracking with emotion. The question hung in the air like an accusation, not just against Tyler, but against David himself. How had he failed so completely as a father? How had he raised a child who could show such disrespect to someone who had served his country? "I'm afraid so," Bob replied gently. "But Mr. Morrison, I believe your son simply doesn't understand what this represents. That's not entirely his fault. It's a failure of all of us to teach the next generation about sacrifice and service. David turned to face Tyler, tears streaming down his face. Do you know what your grandfather did in Vietnam? Do you know how he died? Tyler shook his head, suddenly feeling very small and very young. The cocky teenager had vanished, replaced by a confused boy who was beginning to understand that he had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. Your grandfather saved 12 men in a firefight near Da Nang. David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He threw himself on a grenade to save his squad. He died so that 12 other fathers could come home to their families. And today his grandson, his own blood, spat on the memory of a man who might have fought beside him. David turned back to Bob, his face a mask of anguish. Sir, I have failed as a father. I have failed to teach my son the values that my own father died defending. I don't know how to apologize for this. The moment of victory, Bob stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on David's shoulder. Mr. Morrison, don't blame yourself. This is an opportunity for all of us. Your son made a mistake, but he's young enough to learn from it. The question is, what are we going to do now? Tyler, overwhelmed by the weight of his actions and the pain in his father's eyes, dropped to his knees in front of Bob. Tears streamed down his face as the full magnitude of his disrespect hit him. Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Please, is there anything I can do to make this right? Bob helped Tyler to his feet, his touch gentle despite the hurt the boy had caused. Son, courage isn't just about fighting in wars. Courage is about admitting when you're wrong and having the strength to change. You've just shown me that kind of courage. The transformation in Tyler was immediate and profound. The arrogant teenager who had approached the memorial with such disrespect was gone, replaced by a young man who was beginning to understand the weight of history and the price of freedom. David suggested that Tyler spend his Saturdays at Memorial Park learning from Bob about history, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. Tyler agreed eagerly, sensing that he had been offered something precious, a chance to connect with living history, to understand the stories behind the names on the memorial stones. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his own immediate gratification. Bob, meanwhile, found himself with a new mission. The letter to his granddaughter had evolved into something larger, a responsibility to educate an entire generation about the sacrifices that had secured their freedom. Tyler's ignorance wasn't unique. It was symptomatic of a broader failure to pass on the lessons of history. Over the following months, Tyler underwent a remarkable transformation. He didn't just learn about the Vietnam War. He immersed himself in the entire history of American military service. He read books, watched documentaries, and most importantly, listened to Bob's stories with the reverence they deserved. Tyler began volunteering at the local Veterans Center, helping elderly veterans with daily tasks and simply providing companionship to men and women who had served their country and now found themselves forgotten by society. He discovered that many veterans struggled with loneliness and isolation, and his youthful energy and genuine interest in their stories brought light into their lives. Bob found new purpose in his role as an unofficial historian and educator. He began giving regular talks at local schools, sharing his experiences and those of his fallen comrades with students who had never heard firsthand accounts of war and sacrifice. The military cap, once a source of private grief, became a teaching tool, a tangible connection to history that helped young people understand the reality behind the abstract concept of freedom. The weekly veterans meetings that Frank had invited him to attend became a cornerstone of Bob's new life. Surrounded by men and women who shared his experiences and understood his struggles, he found the community he had been missing since Michael's death. Together, they worked to ensure that the stories of their service would not be lost to time. 1 year later, on Veterans Day, Tyler stood beside Bob at the memorial ceremony. The teenager wore his JROTC uniform with pride, his posture straight, and his eyes bright with purpose and understanding. He had not only learned about military history, but had decided to pursue a career in military service himself, inspired by the stories Bob had shared and the example of sacrifice he had witnessed. Bob placed his hand on Tyler's shoulder. The old military cap still perched on his head, no longer a symbol of pain and loss, but a bridge between generations, a reminder that the values of service and sacrifice could be passed down and renewed in each new generation. "Mr. Bob," Tyler whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for teaching me what real courage looks like." Bob smiled, looking up at the clear blue sky where a red-tailed hawk circled overhead. "No, son, thank you for reminding an old soldier that hope still exists in the hearts of young people. Thank you for proving that the future of our country is in good hands." The gentle breeze carried the sound of the honor guard's rifles firing their salute, and for a moment, Bob could almost hear the voices of his fallen comrades whispering their approval. The military cap remained on his head, but now it carried a new story, a story of forgiveness, understanding, and the enduring power of human connection to bridge any divide. In that moment, surrounded by the names of the fallen and the promise of the future, Bob Mitchell knew that his mission was complete. The torch had been passed, the stories had been shared, and the memory of sacrifice would live on in the heart of a young man who had learned to honor those who came before him